Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown by Fidel Castro's rebels in 1959. The revolutionaries were aided by a US arms embargo placed on Batista the previous year. After he came to power, Castro reached out to America, but US President Eisenhower rejected his advances, and within months he was plotting to help overthrow Cuba's new leader. The US slashed trade with Cuba in 1960, placing strict quotas on the country's sugar. The Cubans reacted by going into business with the Soviet Union. America's response was a near full trade embargo, and when Castro seized all US assets in Cuba, diplomatic ties broke down completely. In 1961, the new US President John F. Kennedy approved an invasion of Cuba which had been planned by the previous administration. A brigade of Cuban exiles trained by the CIA was sent to the Bay of Pigs. The troops were defeated by Castro's army within 3 days. The failed invasion was a major embarrassment for the US and strengthened Cuba's ties with the Soviet Union. The US discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba in October 1962. As Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of the island, the world considered the very real possibility of nuclear war. After 13 tense days and negotiations through back channels, the Soviet missiles eventually left Cuba in return for the secret withdrawal of US missiles in Turkey.
The United States intends to follow closely the completion of this work through a variety of means.
The following year, Kennedy had a hotline installed in the Oval Office, giving the US and Soviet leaders the means for direct communication within minutes. In 1980, facing growing political and economic pressure, Castro announced that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so. 125,000 refugees sailed 100 miles to Florida over a 6-month period. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Castro opened the exit door once again. With dire economic prospects at home, 35,000 Cubans left for America in 1994. The US imprisoned 5 Cuban men on spying charges in 1998. Cuba would later admit the men, who became known as the Cuban Five, were intelligence officers, but Havana claimed they were sent to infiltrate Cuban exile groups rather than the US government. The men each spent more than 10 years in prison. An agreement between Castro and Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez in 2000 distanced Cuba from the US even further. The deal was a badly needed boost for the Cuban economy, as Chavez propped up the Castro regime with discounted oil.
Hombres armados en los alrededores de la casa.
After years of speculation about his health, Fidel Castro stepped down at the age of 81. He'd led Cuba for 49 years. His brother Raúl, who had assumed presidential responsibilities in 2006, formally succeeded him in 2008. Early in his presidency, Raúl Castro appeared to signal an end to hostilities with America, calling better relations mutually advantageous.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
In 2014, US President Barack Obama and Raúl Castro both signaled a new beginning in relations. Their announcements followed Cuba's release of Alan Gross, a US government worker who'd served 5 years in prison in Cuba, and the release of the 3 members of the Cuban Five who remained in jail. The two leaders met face-to-face in 2015. Their discussion at the Summit of the Americas was the first such meeting between US and Cuban heads of state in more than 50 years.